All right, hello there, everyone. This is Mr. Brass, and today I am here with MD Vet, better known as Scott Spaulding. How are you doing, my good sir? I can't hear you again. I heard your laugh, but not you.
Can't hear me at all. How about now?
I can hear you now.
Weird. Sorry, let me just get closer. Better?
Yeah, that's better. I can hear you.
Sorry.
It's
So
fine.
I'm not bad. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good, all things considered. I see you're looking all festive.
Yeah, I couldn't resist the wearing this wearing this for ugly sweater. It's like the Top Lobster and the Damn Wars Christmas Scott Horton.
Yeah, it looks nice. So let's see. So what you been up to lately?
Just work. Nothing exciting. Um, yeah.
Um, you excited for Christmas?
Yeah. I mean, we got. I was. I'm. I have. I guess some problems with delayed gratification to the extent that where I'm trying to push my gift on my wife. The minute it comes in the mail, you gotta open it, hon.
I
Shame.
yeah. I already got my grandfather a Christmas present.
Oh yeah.
It's a it's a it's a Civil War cannon, but
No kidding.
it's like it's a pencil sharpener.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
He'll dig
He
that.
he loves he loves knickknacks like that. The
Oh,
Civil
is he?
He's actually a veteran himself as well.
Oh,
He,
cool.
he fought in the Vietnam War.
My dad too.
Ah, so you're more than one generation when it comes to.
Uh, yeah, pretty much my whole. Well, yeah, everybody in my family, every male in my family. Um, at least back to my great grandfathers. Yeah, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam.
I
With
know I
some
have
great uncles in Korea.
I know I have some family on my dad's side that fought in World War II. I recently found out like a pretty sad but still a bit funny case of one of my aunts, like my great aunts on my dad's like on my dad's side or something, where she actually died because apparently I think she like had a heart attack near a pig den
Ooh,
in the
that's
pig.
terrible.
Um, so I found that out recently. That's on my dad's side, and so anyway, what's actually been your journey to get where you are in this anti-war um, push that you got going?
Uh, well, the long it kind of just it really started with being raised like in a constitutional conservative family, which a lot of people, we were never really neocons. My dad's a little on the hawkish side. He's always had a real bugaboo about Iran that I think goes back to his to sort of his time in the army, working at Fort Meade. But for me, I was raised with these sort of like we need to get back to the Constitution kind of values. And when you really start looking into that, you see that we're just so far from it. So that was my starting point was just okay, what gives with all this? And even I joined the Marine Corps in as a reservist in 2003. Um, and went to Iraq. And I didn't really understand much of what the AUMFs were and how this was all supposed to work, but as things kind of went on, it was kind of clear to me by my second deployment that things weren't quite right, that we weren't really, you know, I was, it's kind of a standard thing for, people. It's not uncommon today, and definitely in the world I was growing up in, and like, that, oh, it's just these rules of fire, and it was, not rules of fire. What's wrong with me? Rules of engagement. I mean, there was even that movie that came out around that time, but also, even from other sort of propaganda movies and stuff I grew up with, if Congress wasn't holding us back kind of stuff. And what I realized is like, and I remember the conversation I was having with a friend where it's like, at least at that point, I came to the conclusion like half measures get you nowhere. That was one step along the way, was realizing that the AOMFs and this counterinsurgency type strategy just can't win. Um, and then I sort of dove more into, well, how is this all supposed to work? And I learned some more about the Marine Corps' history and small wars because I was, interested in Smedley Butler. I definitely like picked up Wars of Rackage. I was a bigger reader then than I am now. Still a reader, but picked up War as a Racket out of curiosity. What is this? Because we're, in the Marine Corps, they teach you memorize in boot camp who are the, what officer won two medals of honor, Smedley Butler, what enlisted man won two medals of honor, Dan Daly. You have to memorize these things. And so, I picked up the book just out of curiosity. Who is this person? And I was a reservist, so in between deployments, I was going to undergrad, and I read about the small war. I did a project or paper about the small wars in Haiti, um, kind of trying to learn more about that role. And more and more, I just sort of kept coming back to this conclusion that we don't win wars with half measures, that eventually you're just gonna you're not gonna get anywhere. To get all the way to the anti-war point came later, kind of as I learned more about libertarianism. And it was while I was at Quantico, and Tom Wood's podcast, or actually even before his podcast came out, he had released. My dad had bought me years and years before this, and it sat on my shelf for a while because I have a habit of stockpiling books and reading them when I get around to them. He bought me the Politically Incorrect Guide to History,
Mhm.
and I had picked that up, and I also came across, and later I came across a lecture series that Tom Woods did based off of that. So I was listening to that on my long commutes to and from Quantico because I lived about 45 minutes away. Um, and it all crystallized like listening to a speech he gave, basically summing up how war is big government's best friend. Kind of made it very clear that everything that, as a constitutional conservative, as a conservative person, and I'm not a constitutional conservative now. I mean, if we could get to that, that would be, I mean, we'd be leaps and bounds better off than we were, but we might be headed back where we are anyways. But I was just in one speech. I mean, I guess there were steps along the way towards being libertarian, and one of my biggest things holding me back was like, well, obviously defense and police. Those were the last two kind of things I couldn't see how libertarian world would deal with it. How could we defend the country, kind of stuff. And it opened me up entirely to thinking differently when I heard the case made that like what you have is a Trojan horse that keeps bringing you more and more big government. That the military is always going to grow. That it's going to be all the phrases we hear that almost sound trite, but that it's a self-licking ice cream cone. It exists to perpetuate its own existence.
Sure.
Um, and we must expand the bureaucracy to protect the needs of the bureaucracy, kind of stuff. Uh, all just kind of came clear to me, and then that was where I kind of made that turn to, okay, this whole thing's bunk, and how I got to eventually seeing uh that you have to, especially if you value liberty, you have to be anti-war, and you have to oppose a standing army, a taxpayer funded standing army, because it has all the same problems of socialist calculation that you would have if you put the government in charge of healthcare or widgets or any other thing. It's going to keep expanding and never allocate resources sensibly.
Yeah, I thought what would keep you back from being a libertarian is the age-old question of who would build the roads.
No, that one was easy. That was an easy one for me. That I was like, well, living in Northern Virginia, especially at that time, and just living, God, I mean, I just recently went, I still live in Baltimore, and Baltimore is kind of its own separate thing, and it's not so bad. But when I was at a reserve unit in DC, and sometimes I was on active duty there, going in every day from Annapolis. It's maybe 20 miles. It takes an hour and a half to drive every day on horrible roads into the capital. Like, so you're seeing this, like, we're right outside the capital, and the road, they can't maintain the roads. Like, it's easy. And anyone in DC that has to drive around DC, I don't understand how they could think the roads are a strong argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you brought up how you got into the army around 2003, I believe.
Yeah, I went to boot camp in February 2003. I signed papers while I was still in high school the year prior. So 2002, I graduated high school, and then I signed my papers in like April 2002.
Was 9/11 any part of the sort of mindset that got you to go there?
No, in fact, so I had signed papers prior to 9/11 because I signed. How did that doesn't add up? Where's my math wrong? I graduated in 2002.
9/11 would have been a year before you
Yeah,
graduated.
yeah, I had signed papers. I know God, it's so long ago. No, either way, well, to answer the question, regardless of that, I was already fully committed. I mean, from the time I grew up in Annapolis, which right outside the Naval Academy, and we would sponsor midshipmen to stay, like we would kind of be their home away from home. You name a military movie, I was watching them long before it was age appropriate. There was nothing I ever wanted to do other than be in the military. So if anything, it kind of like, I guess you could say, gave me some clarity, or made me sort of see, okay, well, we're going to be doing something. Because one of my things, the way I settled on the Marine Corps was a book by, I think his name was Thomas Ricks, called Making the Corps. That kind of made, but prior to reading that book about how the Marine Corps, it talks about going through boot camp, but it also talks about Somalia and what MUs do, Marine Expeditionary Units, and how they're always the force in readiness. They're always ready to act, and that there's always things the Marine Corps is engaged in. It was sort of kind of the point of that book. Prior to that, I was sitting there thinking, pre 9/11, especially, I was thinking maybe I'll join the Coast Guard because I want to join the military, but I don't want to just sit around podunk army base, cleaning rifles and doing training exercises. I had one of my uncles was in the Coast Guard, and they're doing their job. They're actually doing their job every day, as opposed to the military pre 9/11, which was always training for their job but not doing it in my mind's eye. So if anything, it just kind of like, I know I made my mind up to do the Marine Corps at that point. So if anything, it kind of just nailed that down, and made me think, well, okay, now I'm doing it. I still remember when that happened. My one friend was like, "All right, man, you're going to war. Like, this is for real now." And I was, if anything, excited about that prospect.
Mhm. Do you face significant pushback from other veterans about your positions when it comes to being anti-war and stuff?
Other veterans, it's not real. I mean, it's hard to know. Um, my friends who I have discussed it with see where I'm coming from. Um, and aside from that, like, my father and I have had talks about it here and there. And he doesn't really argue with me about it. I think he sees the point that I'm getting at,
Mhm.
but just can't make that final step, the who will build the road step. The, well, wait, this is too much. Just isn't willing to really brook that. That he still seems convinced that there are people that would, and I'm not saying there aren't, people that would want to hurt us, but I'm not really convinced that there's anyone that would really go that far out of their way to do a 9/11 if we weren't, already having a military stationed in Saudi Arabia.
Mhm.
But he seems to think that that would come our way regardless. And it's like, well, there's a lot of countries that don't seem to have those problems, you
So
know?
yeah, so he's not like your hero, Dan Crenshaw.
No, 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 no. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are other veterans, and I'm sure I've had arguments with some, but usually, it go for a few rounds, and I kind of have in my pocket a handful of sort of, you know, usually, I mean, let's be honest, if I'm being honest with myself, there's been times where I've been discussing it with somebody, and it just kind of hits a point where it's like, well, I can't think about that anymore. I'm getting back to work. I'm doing whatever. And I don't have, I may not have an answer for you right now. And I guess I don't have, and then you never get an answer from them, kind of thing. But as far as like, um, other vendors, it's kind of self-selecting. Nobody's going to really end up in my circle for long if they aren't at least willing to hear and think those things through, you know?
Yeah. I brought up Dan Crenshaw because he's a veteran as
Mhm.
well. And I believe I've seen you debating like on a thread that he was in before.
Oh, I'm sure I have. I don't know that he engaged with me directly. I mean, so yeah, just among the things, I guess one of you know one of the things that I just think about is that socialist calculation part. When you're talking to a conservative person, theoretically, there's a few things where it's like, how can you not see that there's no clear way to decide how much of a how many resources should be allocated to solving this problem with the military solution. When you're going to run it through the government, politicians are going to decide, oh well, they're going to have an argument. Should it be 180,000, 190,000, or 210,000 Marines or troops in Iraq, and they're just going to arbitrarily pick the middle number and hope that that works. There's never it's just so kind of asking them, if you believe that, okay, China's going to take over the world tomorrow. Okay, well, if you believe that, then I guess why don't you believe in communism? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Well,
um,
well, let's just put it. I
yeah.
always think it's ridiculous when people bring up the China argument.
Hmm.
China would have like China is going to have a rough time taking Taiwan,
Hmm.
and Taiwan is less than the size of one of the states in the United States, and they're going to have if they take Taiwan, it's going to take a lot of effort.
Yeah. And frankly, um, it would be easier, and it's honestly, I think, more likely, that China takes over Taiwan with kid gloves than by military force. That, they just manage to manipulate the government of Taiwan in such a way that they get what they want, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um,
But I mean, like,
yeah.
even if China did go the route of going to war with Taiwan in order to get them, it
Mhm.
would take a lot of effort for them to do that.
It
And
would.
and
And
and this is talking about a place that it's smaller than one of the states in the United States.
mhm. And the
And
juice and the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, you
yeah,
know? I mean, what it ultimately, if you look at Russia and Ukraine, and I'm frankly, I was, I guess, pleasantly surprised. It does, in a lot of ways, show some of what we're talking about. Obviously, a lot of Ukraine's resistance is organized militarily, but um, it does show, like, what is Russia that relatively not even a weaker defense. I mean, you know, Ukraine has a large numerical army, but mostly they were armed with large, until it kind of hit the phase it's in now, was mostly small man portable arms and troops willing to grind it out that managed to stop a much larger force. And you know, and ultimately, whatever, if Russia ends up with territorial gains, what are they go honestly, what is there going to be to show for it? What at the end of it, even if they end up holding all the territory they hold now, none of it will have been worth it, you know? I don't know how many object lessons we need in that, but there's nothing so valuable in Eastern Ukraine that is worth, I mean, they're blowing it all to shit anyways, you know?
Yeah.
Sorry, pardon my language.
Oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, well, don't you know that the reason why Russia is in Ukraine is because the Ukrainians are just a bunch of Nazis and the Russians just want to stop them?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a that yeah, they people on every side kind of oversimplify that. I mean, there were ultra right wing elements, but I don't think that's Russia's motive. But I don't think, but the Ukrainians certainly aren't pure as the driven snow either. You know.
I mean, let's just put it this way: if Stalin was willing to work with Hitler for a
Yeah.
while, I
Yeah.
don't, I don't see why um, that would be a reason why Putin would go after them.
Mm.
Because, like I said, like if Stalin was willing to work with the Nazis until they didn't,
Mm.
I don't see why that would be a particular like it seems like plenty of governments would be more than willing to go along with that unless it somehow affects their bottom dollar.
Oh yeah. I mean, what was the It was Israel was giving Tavors to the Israeli assault rifle, the Tavor, Tavor, and Azov battalion members were pictured carrying them, and it was a bit of a to do in Israel over that. Why and Netanyahu was not interested. They did not um, restrict arms trade. There was a movement to restrict arms trade to ultra right wing groups, and the Netanyahu's coalition did not go along with that. They continued arming them in spite of the fact that it was publicized that they were arming ultra right wing elements. So yeah, even an Israeli government can make odd bedfellows if it's going to help their bottom line. You know?
Yeah. Um, and speaking of like obviously the Nazis, you bring up how the U.S. could have done World War II differently, and that, funny enough, seems to be one of your more controversial takes when you go on Twitter.
Yeah.
Explain a bit of your reasoning and why do you think that it's so controversial?
So the main thing I think is, and I was just having another talk with a friend of mine about this actually, is that I think in the United States I think that there's a reason. I mean, if you listen to what's the podcast? It's by Tom Secker. I think it's called Spy Culture, Clandestine. He does a lot of deep dives into how the military influences movies and stories and the little things they insert in the end. In Jurassic Park, they go out of their way to insert that. Oh yeah, we don't. There's no reason in Jurassic Park 3 that Marines show up at the end, except that DoD wants to show that there's a military solution to every problem. It's the reason that we have when there was a teacher shortage, they say, "Oh, let's just send National Guard troops," as if that's the best possible way, not retired teachers or you know what I mean. Now, to some extent, it's when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is the one force that they can readily order to do anything that they order to do. But to another extent, with it like in the US, in the American mindset, militarism is so deeply ingrained that it seems like, and in part because of propaganda, that the military is the first best solution to any given problem. I mean, if there's a bad guy anywhere in the world, the movies have taught us that we need to send the military to kill them. And it's reinforced in school with the lessons they get. It's always the good guy that we don't hear about. People are very concerned about CRT and how people are how they're undermining American history. But when you still in the standard world U.S. history class and American history class leaves out most of the America bad the American military did bad things in this place. That's not really in the curriculum. The things that stick in a kid's mind are World War II, good guys save Jews. You know what I mean? Um, so all that's to say, I bring up this point that, and granted, and I'll grant that really in reality, this was not politically viable. But what I'm trying to change is what is politically viable in people's mind. So what I'll bring up is that, some people have called it the Avion test. I think Jeremy Kaufman calls it that. But and there's a little, I question the history around this idea, but basically, my whole premise is I don't think you have humanitarian motives if you're not willing to imagine your neighbor is, imagine there's a hostage situation across the street or something, you know, and the American mindset is, well, we've got to go in and kill the bad guys, and we got to lock the doors to that house, not let anyone out, and go in and kill the bad guys. And never does it occur to anyone, if there's a humanitarian crisis in country X, Y, or Z, the first step is not open our doors and bring them in. That doesn't even cross anyone's mind in the American mindset. Um, Unfortunately, and I'm just trying to open the door to that thought process. So what I usually mention to people, because I am generally pro-immigration person, I just try to open people's minds to the fact that the excuse that was given, now granted, I think, racism and xenophobia in general and anti-Semitism to some extent contributed to this, but the excuse that was given why we couldn't open, we were given excuses for why they could not accept more people from Eastern Europe during as Hitler expanded control, as it was first apparent to State Department officials, to the embassy shortly after Hitler's takeover, that he was making it a very uncomfortable place for Jews, and they were being forced out and maltreated. And there were even people in the Department of State, some of whom were saying, we need to expand our allotment so that people who are being persecuted can escape this persecution. And the door was kept closed. You know what I mean? And even as the atrocities got worse, the door stayed closed to people. So we tell ourselves this narrative constantly. We went in and killed the bad Nazis, but the excuse that was given is, well, we can't just take in all the riffraff of the world. And they limited to something like 50,000 people prior to War One. I'm pretty certain of the statistic that was about 50,000 people prior to 1939 that we had admitted from Nazi-controlled territory into the United States, and not all of those were Jews. By the end of the war, we had 12.2 men in uniform being armed, fed, clothed, and housed. We had 200,000 internees, 500,000 POWs. That's getting you up to the 13 million people that were just being fed, clothed, and housed in the United States. That doesn't include all of the people that were working for the military in some capacity in the United States also, who were making their livelihood off of that. And we were feeding more or less all of the Soviet Union and all of England, and arming England and the Soviet Union. All of those resources were able to be allocated to arming those countries, but no more were allocated to bringing people in danger out of danger. That's never considered as an option. So what I try to open up is, just imagine a world, there were only about 9 million Jews in Eastern Europe in the first place. Imagine a world where instead of arming 12 million people, the first option we considered was, is there any way we can get those 9 million people out of harm's way? And people will flip out about this. They hate, you want to give the Nazis everything? It's like, well, this is the question. Is the piece of dirt in Eastern Europe more important to you, or is the human lives that you're purporting to want to save? Because if it was theoretically possible to save them without killing anyone, maybe that's preferable. You know, I'm not saying for certain. I'm not saying that it would, it is. I'm saying in a world of bad choices, maybe the better bad choice is to have saved 9 million Jews rather than kill X many million Germans to save 3 million Jews. And I'm not even saying that's necessarily would have been entirely possible, but that all of them could have been saved, you know. Um, but yeah, people will sputter and spit and they get so mad because the right solution is what we did. There's no other possible way that history could have unfolded except for us to kill our way through the bad guys, you know, at any expense.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and
Uh,
I mean, obviously, the real answer that you would give is because you believe Hitler was a good person and that there's good in everybody.
no, I mean, yeah, it's just it. So you must be loving Hitler. Like, no, dude. Like, honestly, I personally, I could be wrong. I mean, there are counterpoints like the North Korean regime. Um, but I don't think I do believe in the long run, state central planning fails. Um, now the and there are places where it obviously has been longer lived than thought possible. I think some of that comes as a result, actually, of U.S. interventionism, that in some sense sanctions regimes and this exterior threat can strengthen this constant threat that exists against, say, Cuba or North Korea from the United States, kind of gives the regime a boogeyman to point to and blame for all of the people of those countries' problems so that they don't lose control. I don't know. It's hard. You can't know entirely whether that is the only reason they're still standing. But especially like if you take the Nazi regime, I mean, Hitler was a coke-addled meth head. You know, he wasn't long for this world, and he didn't have that many allies who wanted him around much longer, anyways. So I don't know that really would have lasted that much longer, anyhow. Um, and yeah, and again, it kind of people they kind of well, we had to do something, and it's the other thing that people don't really like and never really give a clear answer on because they can't. And I'm trying to get to this question of like socialist calculation is okay. Well, what's your non-arbitrary line? I mean, this isn't to say if I saw my neighbor beating his wife, I might intervene. I probably would intervene. I like to think I would intervene. You know what I mean? But and that does, failing to intervene on some level says something about your character. But if there was perfect peace in the world, except for somewhere on the other side of the planet, a man was beating his wife. Um, do we all drop everything and spare no? Are we morally wrong? Is it evil for us to not be buying a $10,000 plane ticket right now, flying halfway across the planet, and taking that guy to task? You know what I mean? There's a question of how many everyone right now somewhere somebody is being tyrannized. And all of these people who say we had to do something in this specific situation, well, how many people have to be tyrannized before you have to get off your couch, drop your phone and go fight? You know what I mean? What is this line? Where is what's the non-arbitrary boundary? The Chinese were raping Nanking. We didn't go and fight them. Why, like whatever the case may have been, how do you decide at what point are you going to decide that it's worth any expense to prevent tyranny somewhere? Because I think that if you did accept that there is no limit, we have to fight tyranny anywhere on the globe. We're morally obligated to do so, and it's the government's responsibility, and through government, then you're accepting that we have to have a global military police state, the likes of which our $1 trillion military isn't capable of. We would need a 20 or $30 trillion military. We would need a 10 million man army policing the entire planet if you think that no tyranny can ever occur anywhere. And you would end up with tyranny right here at home trying to make that happen. You
Yeah.
know, um,
Es-
you'd end up getting what you would get the fascism that you were purporting to fight if you said that we must do anything to prevent tyranny anywhere on the globe.
yeah.
If that make
Uh,
does that make sense? Does that follow logically?
Yeah, that follows logically. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
And I sometimes joke with some of my Jewish friends. I said, if it makes you feel any better, Hitler killed other people than just Jews.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, that's they that gets left out of the story a little, or and not. I guess it's a there's a reason that that's focused on, but yeah, it's not entirely fair to leave out other people either, but
I believe it was like 9 million Jews and like 6 million others.
yeah, I think, well, yeah, it's there's generally, yeah, I'm not gonna get it. All of a sudden we're gonna end up getting canceled, like I'm gonna have to delete the tweet like the New Hampshire Libertarian Party for questioning them for throwing around the wrong numbers.
Uh, yeah, I'm not sure the numbers either, but I know it's something
I mean,
like
my understanding is about 6 million Jews minimum, and then something like 3 million POWs and 3 million. There's a great book actually. If you do want to, a great book that actually was very interesting to me and really I learned a lot from is called No Simple Victory by a guy named Norman Davies. It's a little old now. It's from the 2000s, but I've read that book at least twice, and I've recommended it to others because it kind of goes in. It was the first place where I learned, speaking of just the military, what is fed to us in our standard high school world history classes and whatnot. It's the first place that overturned this idea that the Americans didn't. We liberated a handful of PW camps. The Soviets liberated almost all of the Jews that were liberated. You know what I mean? And it's obviously an improvement over death, but living under Stalin is not was no calling that liberation is farcical. You know what I mean?
I prefer to call it like, have you ever watched that movie Megamind?
No, I've not.
Well, in one scene there's a superhero like where, well, not a super, he's a super villain, but you have one guy like he was originally a villain and he conquered a city,
Mm,
and he got bored of it, and so he wanted to create a hero to stop him,
uh,
and the hero ended up becoming the villain and overtaking him. And once he beat the original guy, like the people says we're free, and the hero, now villain, says I prefer to call it under new management.
yeah, yeah. I mean, in a sense, and that actually brings me to another thing that actually I had learned about in the past, but then it kind of I incorporated into my sort of argument of late. Um, when we're talking about what other solutions were available other than armed invasion of Europe, say, right? Is that there were the entire time throughout the war, and especially, but mainly post-war. A lot of their effort was post-war. At least the lion's share of people that were moved. But there was an organization that was privately funded, called the Brika, I believe it was called, that was helping to smuggle in through the war, and again in huge numbers after, smuggling Jews out of Soviet occupied of all of Europe, because at the time, and into Israel, because at the time England was not allowing, they were trying to keep control over Palestine, and more Jews showing up was destabilizing the political situation. So they had destroyers, they had coastal patrols turning away Jews that were trying to make it to Israel, and all along the way every country in the world was trying to stop them, including the US. The US was forcing them to stay in camps that some I think it's called Long Way Home, is a documentary where they talk about it, how at first we were happy to be set free by we were glad to be in the American zone and set free, but eventually, they were still, they were keeping us fenced in too. They were putting us in these camps that were not much better. Nobody was actively killing us, but it was still a death in its own right to not be able to go back to my home, to not be able to find my family. We were locked in these camps that the US was running, hundreds and thousands of people locked into camps, and the idea was we need to keep an eye on them. We have to figure out where the borders are going to settle. We can't have these millions of migrants moving back all over the place. And there were vengeance killings happening. So we're trying to keep a lid on this situation. But the US government was responsible for trying to keep Jews contained that wanted to return to their homes or go to Israel, and stopping them. And there was a group of people working illegally. Some of them were US through bribes, and Jews that were sympathetic in the Soviet army and in the American army who were smuggling Jews out. But it wasn't just a military; it was a civilian and underground illegal effort to get Jews out of Soviet Europe, and it was going on under Nazi Europe too. They had already worked these smuggling paths through the Alps to get people out of Germany and Europe to Israel, even throughout the entire war. They were doing this completely privately and against the objections of the Allies. So, like, the fact that that could be done on a shoestring budget, privately raised funds and completely illegal under the nose of the Nazis and the Stalinists, kind of indicates that where there's a will, there's a way. And if the will that we put towards the next humanitarian crisis that people want to get us ginned up about, if the will is how do we get people out of harm's way, we can do it. You know what I mean? But our will is always turned towards, well, we got to kill the bad guys.
Mhm.
And I just don't think that that's, I think that it's, I question anyone's humanitarian motive if it's really, I question whether it's more about selling weapons than saving lives,
Mhm. Makes sense. I also seen on your Twitter that you have a sort of a link to a website that's about defending the guard.
Yeah, yeah. So, Defend the Guard is my like hobby horse. It's what I'm desperately working to get moving in Maryland. Um, it's what I spend most of my spare time on here, and it's what other people in other states are working on. The Defend the Guard concept is basically meant to. It's actually a pretty small ask, and it shouldn't be controversial at all. It should be an obvious pass. It's asking Congress to declare war or refuse to declare war. So even if you've been if somebody's listening and is seething at everything I've said to this point, forget all that and just listen to the fact that Congress hasn't declared war since 1994. During World War II, we declared war 6 times against Japan, Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. Against every individual country that soldiers were going into, we declared war. Um, and I believe that the reasons, amongst others, for declaring war, having Congress vote to declare war, every war we've declared, we have won definitively. Um, the reason for declaring war, in part, aside from putting it in the hands of Congress so the executive cannot just do what it had done historically, as Lincoln said, kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was at stake when nothing could have been further from the and this our founders recognized was one of the greatest of all kingly oppressions. Um, that's a quote from Lincoln, about why the president shouldn't be able to just start wars or send troops to conflict anywhere he pleases. It's always been meant to be left up to Congress. And beyond that, I think Congress declaring war has those congressmen staking their political reputation on the outcome, and a successful outcome at that. And in doing so, it assures that not only that the people politically support this war and want to see it through, but also that the resources will be allocated to ensure that it happens. Now, I personally object to that and don't want any wars. But all we're asking is that that's the lowest bar. That's the bar, is that Congress declares war before the National Guard, not even all troops, because there's some legal quirks around what the National Guard is. It's technically the state's militia, first, and the reserve force second. It's asking that Congress must do this one thing, one of their most important duties, before the National Guard can be taken to war. The goal being that Congress really likes, or the military really likes, using the National Guard. It's this concept called total force integration, where the Guard is more or less interchangeable with active duty units as intended to be. So that way, if they do ever need them, they're not like, having second rate equipment and second rate training, but instead are up to speed. If they want to do this, if they want to keep that up, this total force integration, then they've got to, after 21 years of war in 13 countries, they've got to either declare war or take the troops out of them, at least keep the National Guard out of it. So the goal is hopefully to have, so states will pass a bill saying that our state's guard, Maryland's guard, will not go to combat operations absent a declaration of war by Congress. If several states do this, and I think even just one state, honestly, especially if it's a bigger state like California or a state with a lot of reserve units or a state with certain guard units that are more heavily relied upon, if a state were to pass this, it sends a very clear signal to Congress that they've got to, and the president, that they can't just keep troops in Syria, Somalia, Mali, getting involved in Kenya and all over the globe in combat without having some accountability, because they're very happy right now having 21 years without having voted on it. And even then, it was only an AUMF, which just kind of said the president could do whatever he wants, which completely undermines what's meant, the system that's meant to exist. So that's the idea of Defend the Guard. It's just states asking firmly, or saying that our guard can't be used unless Congress has declared war. In my mind, that's a step towards getting out of these wars entirely, but it's such a small step towards that that I don't think there's any reason that anyone should object to it. Congress could override it the next day by just declaring war, and I wouldn't say I would be fine with that, but at least we would know where they stand, and they would be politically accountable for that, which would be a huge improvement over what we have now.
Yeah, that does make sense. What do you make of the talks of adding women to the selective service?
I don't make much of it. I mean, the selective service is the truth of the matter is, if they want a draft, they'll bring back a draft. It's a stupid, ridiculous, and unfair system to, deny people their full privileges of citizenship unless they register with the system. It's always been unjust. Incorporating women to it just increases the injustice. They had the option to just end it, and again, the sad truth of the matter is they would just reinstitute conscription when they wanted to in the future, regardless. There was no conscription prior to World War II, and then there was conscription during World War II, World War One, then no conscription, then conscription came back for World War II, and it stayed. They could get rid of it and bring it back at the drop of a hat, anyways. So, but they don't want to get rid of it because, again, they don't want to be politically accountable. So it does tell us where they stand on that. They want to continue the system. They're not willing. They would rather just have things stay the way they are as much as they can. Adding women, frankly, it doesn't do much for the force. This is just about the fact that they have to get around the Supreme Court's finding that having male-only conscription was unjust. So it's just them trying to get around that. And yeah, adding women to conscription is just, extra tyranny on top of what is already a stupid system.
Yeah. Personally, I think the purpose of adding women to conscription is more or less to eventually lead to it being destroyed, because women make up the majority of voters. And as it stands now, men are the only ones that can be conscripted, and women make up the majority voters. So you could realistically have a situation where women women vote more and push their majority in the voting, and they elect a war hawk that wants to institute conscription, and they won't actually have to go to war. So you leave one party that's electing someone and they don't actually have any skin in the
Bear
game.
the consequences. Yeah.
And
Yeah, go on, sorry.
yeah, and so that's one reason. And people think that if we add women to that, they'll say, well, women will say, wait, you mean if we elect a war hawk, we might actually have to put our skin in it? Oh no, we're just getting rid of the conscription then.
I mean, that's plausible. I don't. we'll see. We'll see. I mean, they're going. I believe Congress is going to follow through with it. So we'll see how that plays out. I frankly think so many people are so politically. I mean, me again being I was a very special child. Let's say, I was itching for the day I could sign up for selective service. Went down. I already knew how to do it. I had looked it up, and I was going down to the post office to do it the first day I could, and took the ASVAB test the first chance I got, like because I wanted to be in the military so badly. Um, I don't know what the experience is like for most other people. I mean, I imagine most find out somewhere. It's probably their guy. I'm guessing it's probably like your guidance counselor when you're applying for college. They have to have a conversation with the boys. Hey, fill out this form, and most of the kids don't know what I don't know how many people don't have access to certain rights or sorry, right calling them rights is ridiculous. I'm using the leftist language, but access to certain programs and entitlement programs. They just, somewhere along the way, something says you have to fill out this form, and they don't think about it any further. I don't think most of our electorate is very politically aware, or even knows that, like they think they barely probably remember filling out some form. They don't think of the draft as a realistic possibility.
Yeah.
Um,
So especially now, it's becoming more realistic of a possibility
yeah.
because of, for one, the situation with Russia and Ukraine,
Mhm.
and another thing is that the number of people that are going into the military is actually going way down.
That's
They're
true.
they're not meeting their numbers, and what's to say that Biden say, well, look, like Biden could easily tomorrow say, look, we're not meeting our quota numbers, so we're
Mm.
reinstating the draft.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very interested. I mean, there's a lot of there's a especially Danny Scherzen and some other respect. And I sometimes wonder what is their motives here, but there's some very respectable kind of anti-war leftists who really think that conscription is, well, they think of it as sort of a leveler, a societal leveler that, when the, I don't believe that, but they seem to think that, when the Harvard boys are down in the muck with the working class, that it's better for society in some way. And then when our political class is more made up of drafted veterans or people that at least joined because they joined before getting drafted, so they would have some element of control, that's better for our political life. And they also seem to believe that when mass conscription is implemented, it can for unjust for like things like Vietnam. I think they're basing too much of their experience on Vietnam and not on World War One or World War Two or the other kind of steady state operation or Korea. Um, and the other steady state operations where no one really bucked about the draft. I mean, there were draftees in Korea, and nobody really, it didn't gin up an anti-war movement. I think they're basing a lot of their experience on. They seem to think that if there's a draft, it will mobilize people to be anti-war, and I don't really. I see one most recent anecdote of that, but not all of the previous wars where that didn't happen, where conscription existed, but people still went along with the wars. Um,
Yeah,
so I questioned that thought process. Uh,
yeah,
and then I'm very skeptical. I mean, I don't want to. I really respect a lot of their work, but I'm really skeptical. Some of these people in, let's say, in their own podcasts or behind closed doors are, well, it's a path. It's a pathway to. I literally. It's a pathway to it's a pathway to getting, instead of trying to fight for Medicare for all, we can get VA for all if we get everyone drafted. I've heard that. You know what I mean? That
yeah,
if we get mass conscription, then we can get VA for everyone, and then we have nationalized health care. Um, is literally part of their motivations. They don't speak about it very publicly, but it's there. You
yeah.
know?
Um,
Um,
yeah. I mean, yeah. I would say like a common defense that I've heard of conscription is that it allows citizens to not be completely detached from the lives of soldiers who defend them.
yeah, there's some truth to that. There was another there was a I'm not going to remember it right now, but there were some books I read when I was just joined when I was just in the Marine Corps, and it was about it was harping on that, how much, again, that the civilian military divide. um and I don't know, how I come down on that. I think on some level, when people are conscripted, they do get some idea of what military life is like, but there's sort of two countervailing winds. First, like you said, I mean, I guess women not being conscripted, there's half the voting populace that doesn't really know what that's like. Second, at that, when you look at countries where, I mean, we're kind of the abnormal, as far as, especially as militarist as our society is, we're abnormal in the sense that we're not North Korea or South Korea, sorry, South Korea or Israel or so many other countries. You speak to, you meet people from Italy or Nordic countries, and a lot of them were conscripted for a year or two. You know what I mean? And they still seem, it generally, at least, two things I think are true when I do meet my cousin's husband. Oh yeah, I was in the Carbonari for 2 years or whatever, and um, they 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 seem very, very civilianized very quickly. Nobody seems to take it very seriously, at least in a certain crust of society. I think what you end up with, and what people should think care, if there are, like, I know this isn't, I don't think this is your mindset, but maybe it is. Um, for people from the left that seem to think it's going to kind of mix society and get a better understanding and bridge the civil military divide, like, you're still going to have Harvard boys. If they get any job, it's going to be a very cushy job that their daddy got them. You know what I mean? And if you look at, say, Israel, there's certain units where, the politically connected go, and there's certain units where the politically ambitious go, because everyone knows that that's an elite unit. But even then, they get a cushy job in that unit. Um, and what's always going to happen is the shittiest jobs fall on the poor and brown and unpolitically connected.
Yeah,
Um, and so you're not really leveling society or commingling. You're giving the majority of people who are not advocating for this are just going to have to spend 2 or 3 years of their lives doing a shitty job. Because most conscription duties are just, they're going to take you up for 2 years, and they're going to give you, a few months of that as training. They're not going to invest a lot in you being anything more than a truck driver or a cook or something, those kind of generic jobs that don't require much training. So you end up with just a lion's share of people that have to just defer their lives for 2 years and do this thing that they would just rather forget or not talk about. Is, at least when I do meet people that are from those countries, or hear people from Korea discuss, like, oh yeah, I was in the Navy, I was drafted in the Navy, I was treated like shit for 2 years, and then I got back to my life again. It's not, it maybe gives them a view of what the military is that maybe makes them more intelligible of it, but I don't know what societal benefit I'm curious what you think the benefit of it is.
I don't think there is really any benefit of it because, I mean, sure, a citizen may get some benefit knowing about like what the military life is like and maybe appreciating what soldiers go through. They might get that out of it, but you have to know that they didn't willingly go into it for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
They were.
Yeah.
So it's much more likely, in my opinion, that they'll just end up growing to hate the military even more than they would have beforehand because
Yeah,
they're
it
forced to
just
do.
got I don't see, I mean, I think in Israel the military is well regarded generally, but I don't see the reverence for it coming from everyone having been in it. I see when I do see some of the people that were draftees, kind of, well, it was this thing. You know what I mean? I just did this thing and then I moved on with my life. Um uh and I think The other thought is that I think it does enable, at least for a while, until the draft gets, let's say a stupid war does start up. Let's say it was Iraq in 2008. You would see a lot more people being drafted in as cannon fodder, um, before they hit the people that started pulling college deferments and pulling from the middle class. I think there is something to the theory that when the wars get big enough to draw from the middle class, that maybe at least in Vietnam that mobilized people against it. But there's a lot of people, there's a lot of body bags filled with poor people who no one cared about that
Yeah,
got drafted. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just
I've said it's
on
basic.
some level I do wish, because there are times where people seem very very uninformed, and I don't know every damn thing, but when you say that they're China's gonna have to bring a ladder and a lunchbox to take over Taiwan, you know what I mean? There's people that seem, I constantly confront this, where people like live in this fever dream where Russia or China is going to just leap across the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean in one if our military took one day off, if everyone just took one day off, then tomorrow morning the Chi-Coms would control half of California. We'd wake up and there would be, Chinese patrolling all of our streets if the military just took one. They really seem to think it. It's like there's no infrastructure for that. They don't, and they don't have the ships. They don't have the aircraft. They couldn't possibly achieve what you seem to think will happen overnight. Um,
Well, in
and
California,
I do think, sometimes I do think, like, damn, I wish people knew and understood more about just basic things aside from learning everything from Red Dawn, you know.
well,
Um,
in
that I could see some value in, but I'm not sure that, drafting some high school dropout and making him like kick boxes around a supply closet is going to achieve that end, which is the one thing I would like to get out of bridging the civil military divide, is a little bit of knowledge of what actually exists, what the threats are actually like.
well,
You know,
I made the joke that if China invaded California, California would give up because they realize their politics are about identical.
right? Yeah, you
This,
know.
why are we fighting? We agree on everything.
Well, that's what even when, that's my whole thing when I try to turn tables on like conservative folks. It's like, okay, you think the Chinese are going to take over? How well do you think the Chinese communist system works? Like, if you think that it's so efficient that this would be a cakewalk for them, then you clearly seem to believe that their system is better than ours. You
Yeah,
know, in which case, why do you oppose it? And if you don't believe it's better, then why are you worried about it? You know, but
yeah. Um, a common thing that I actually have heard you talking about before is, I think some people find odd, is that you would still say that you're a patriot. Um, how would you define patriotism yourself?
okay, so just distinguishing between nation and country. I love my homeland. I do. I love where I'm from. I hate the government of Maryland. I still want to live in Maryland because I love the love of your home, patria, your fatherland. You know what I mean? The place where you are from. That's how I would define patriotism first. And second, I would sort of wrap myself in the cloth of the American patriots who um who formed militias and organized to expel, and organized. It was more than just, it wasn't a small endeavor, and it took a lot of policing their own, I mean, it started with the committees of safety and organizing boycotts of English products years prior to the war, and organizing society around this principle that we're going to hold each other accountable for each other, maintaining our liberty. You know what I mean? And if you're undermining it by paying the tariffs, paying the stamp tax, then you're going to be run out on the rail too, because you seem to love the convenience and and all of the things that are undermining liberty in this country. You seem to love those things more than liberty and what we value, what we theoretically still value in this country. So I would say that I at least in spirit, and I fall short of this too. I don't have the networks around. I want to join a freedom cell when I find the time. Um, but if the American insurgents who fought off the British and made their states ungovernable. I mean, when you look at when you look at Massachusetts, everything outside of Boston was ungovernable before the first shot was fired. They refused, everyone collectively refused to sit for jury duty. The courts were incapable. I mean, the reason that the Intolerable Acts demanded, you know, trials by what do they call them, trials at sea, or military tribunals basically, and why that was part of the Intolerable Acts by the British, was because they had organized to say, we're not enforcing these laws anymore. You will not find a jury that will vote someone guilty for breaking this crime. They will vote not guilty and they will walk out. We're not even going to sit for the jury because we don't find this tribunal to be even just. It shouldn't even exist. So they couldn't seat courts. Even when they arrested somebody, they couldn't try them because nobody would sit for jury duty. Um, and that was all organized by the Sons of Liberty and Committees of Safety. And as long as those people are considered patriots, then I think I am too. But if you think that obedience to this government is patriotism, then, I think you're a redcoat or a Tory, and you don't deserve to call yourself a patriot.
Yeah. What do you make of Biden's changes to the military?
I'm curious what changes you um picture from him. I mean, I'm not super super involved, but I'm curious. I mean, I could see some changes that are happening. I just this morning was commenting on something, but I'm curious which one specifically, and I might add in some others if you don't.
I think more people get in is like with affirmative action sort of things, where they seem to be hiring more based on, let's say, LGBT, like how you identify, like sexual orientation wise and the like.
Well, so are we talking in like the top leadership or?
I I think like it's just saying all the way down where people are saying like how affirmative action is basically being implemented in the army, where they're just basically picking people based on like sexual orientation.
Uh,
They're
so I can speak to that even back. Let's go to. I was friends with an officer selection officer. That's the Marine Corps. They use officers to recruit future officers from colleges. Um, so I think that position's called an OSO. And I was friends or buddies with an OSO down in Florida when I was living down there. And and what was interesting, and this was also the case for me when I joined. They do have quotas. They do literally. He would have to, scrape the bottom of the barrel to find people with certain demographic characteristics to sign up to become an officer and go to officer candidate school. And people with, let's say, demographic characteristics more like mine, it didn't matter if you were a water walk. You had to walk on water. If you were a white man or an Asian man. This was what my OSO told me when I was considering applying to be an officer in the early 2000s. If you're not running an 18-minute 3 mile and doing 20 pull-ups, don't waste your time if you're white or Asian. You know what I mean? If you're anything else, we got you. And the OSO I was friends with, this was about 2014, 15, 16. So this is long before Biden came in. Um, and this was Trump came in when I was still knew this guy. He would have to he could find right in at University of Florida, he could fill his entire quota of white and Asian potential officers, and he would have to drive all over hell and creation just to find one female of certain demographic characteristics that could even pass a fitness test. And most of the time, and he was saying, I've got to drive 2 hours to get this girl to work out every weekend. She's not intrinsically motivated enough to get herself in shape. So I have to go and get her in shape just to get her on this contract because I have to find someone that meets this quota. So that's kind of always existed. I imagine it's probably has become more apparent or more specific with types of characteristics, it's plausible. But that's always been the case, that there's you know, the best of the best are not well, let's just say you have to be extra special good if you are white or Asian male to get in to, let's say, being an officer at least.
especially Asian,
Yeah. Um,
because apparently they seem to be kicking everyone's ass.
um, so that was the case in the past, and I'm sure it continues to be the case. Uh, Beyond that, the things I've seen that have been changed, I mean, they definitely, everyone's, I think you're in agreement with this, but I mean, one of my objections, again, going back to how I came to be anti the existence of our military, and I might have to get off soon just because, or at least run upstairs. We might have to pause for a second so I can charge my computer. I'm going to lose it. Sorry, just so you know. If I do cut out randomly, that's what happened, and I'll be back on. Um, but recently, they wanted to expand. I was thinking about this because this is one of the things that always drove me nuts in the military is, frankly, they're too tolerant of fraternization. I I got screwed over for a reenlistment bonus when I was in the Marine Corps, basically because I trash talked my my career planner to his side piece, not knowing that they were discreetly sleeping with each other, you know, and I I remain convinced that nobody who has the same boss, civilian or military, but even more so military, should be sleeping with each other under any circumstances. Um,
That brings a conflict of interest.
yeah. And I was sitting here thinking that the Air Force is about to and extend parental leave for women and for their partner, whoever their co-parent, whoever that happens to be, to something like 12 weeks for both of them. And one of the things that always galls me is, like, it's I always had the perspective that first enlistment, you probably should be not allowed to marry. If you do marry, you should still be required to be in the barracks. If you have children, you should be drummed out, frankly. If you're on your first enlistment, you should be living in the barracks, contributing to your organization full time. They invest a ton of money, tons of money to get somebody through the 6-month training pipeline. So you enlist for 4 years. Your last 2 months, you're not doing anything usually. Your first 6 months, you're in training. You're not contributing. When you finally join, you know, you're only borderline useful, and then there's only about a 2.5 year window where you're a contributing member of the unit during your first enlistment. And if somebody on their first enlistment is allowed to get knocked up and take 12 weeks of leave, and the truth of the matter is, most most females in the military are dating a male in the military. A lot of males in the military are dating females in the military, but a lot of males in the military date outward. There's fewer females in the military than male, and almost all female. I've never met a female in the military that wasn't dating a male in the military once in my life. They are always dating another male in the military. So most of the time when they get pregnant, it's from another male military member. And that means that you're taking potentially two people that are on their first enlistment out for 12 weeks. That's 36, that's 24 weeks. That's half a year. So if there are two people on their first enlistment that have a kid together, you're depriving the military of 6 months of a 4-year contract. You know, um, it's ridiculous. But that just goes to the fact that I realized, and what kind of turned me to where I am now, bringing it all back around, is that DoD, as it exists, the standing military we have, is a product of the progressive era. I mean, the standing army infrastructure, if you read biographies of, that's where you get John Lejeune, that's where you get Pershing, and the people that formed the modern military, and the professionalism and the structure we have now, all came in under Wilson, or in the progressive era. And they had these ideas. I mean, Stanley Butler was a full blown socialist, and most people at the time were. They were progressives. It was literally in the era. They wanted to make this system where you join the military, you're drafted in, you get your education there. It's where the Marine Corps University and Marine Corps Institute, where you have these correspondent. We're going to teach everyone through correspondence. We're going to make them all literate. We're going to make them all sober. We're going to turn that. We're going to make that. We're going to refound America. These are things they actually said with this cadre of fine, upstanding young men that we'll create. It was proto-fascist, really, and that's the military we have today. It still exists, and it's always from the very beginning they were salivating. This is how we get. During World War I, this is where we got Federal Housing Administration, was building housing for the military-industrial complex. Where we got the first steps of the military of nationalized healthcare was through the military. It's where the excuse Sputnik was the excuse for the Department of Education. Actually, and the GI Bill. That we have to where is this money going that we're giving to GIs? We need to figure out what schools can be accredited and how to distribute this money. All of these they always use the military because the conservatives are sympathetic to it. They always use the military as the excuse to expand and test out government programs before they go live with them nationally. And so this is just one more example of that, but it's why it can, amongst other things, the fact that the military relocates people every 3 years, it breaks up families, it moves people around the country, all as part of a social engineering program. There's a reason military families are notoriously unstable, and I think that serves an agenda,
Uh,
demonstrably so.
yeah,
So,
you pretty much answered my number 9 question. So we're going to get to the last question, and that is, what are your plans going forward?
really, the number one, two, and three thing on my agenda is to get Defend the Guard introduced in Maryland, hopefully passed through committee. It's a process, but I think it's the single most important thing we can do to move the ball forward and make this conversation happen about the appropriate role for the military in the United States and our appropriate role in the world. So that's really that's my goal is that I don't really have any other political priorities until I get Defend the Guard moved
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
it dies.
Mhm. All right. So can you tell the audience where they can find you?
Of course, Twitter at MDVet4 is my primary. It is shadow banned right now. Um, but I have an alt also. You if you're savvy, it's pretty easy to find. And then I am reinitiating my podcast at Anti-War Podcast, where you don't have to be full-blown anti-war. If anyone's listening to this and wants to share, I just want your story or your anything, any piece of art, one song you like that's kind of an anti-war tune. Just tell me a short interview, 10, 15 minutes tops. Tell me the thing that you read, heard, movie you saw that made you think differently about war and how it made you think. You know what I mean? And I just want to put as many different reasons and takes and songs and things and pieces of art for people to look at out there that'll maybe make them think differently. I guess that's my number two. If that's my other plan going forward is to get that podcast rolling again.
All right. Cool. Well, you heard it here. This has been Scott Spaulding, and I want to say it was so great to have you on, sir.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mhm. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass of the Brass Exchange, and have a good night, everyone.